Well, let's get started. That's a good thing to do. We're on page 2. We're already made through page 1. I did that to encourage you. Already on page 2, right? So I just put some notes down to get an overview here, the idea of what we're going to be doing. But Galatians is one of the more important books in the Bible because it really nails the gospel and tells you how important it is. Clear statement of the gospel other than Romans. Has anybody ever thought about that? If you had a desert island, only could get 2 books for the Bible, what 2 would you pick?
Romans for sure.
Romans for sure, yeah. And John the other one, I would think.
Yeah, Gospel of John.
Yeah, and Romans, yeah. Galatians would be maybe 3rd or 4th, so, yeah. Yeah, but fortunately, on the desert island, they don't give you Bibles, but if they did, I'd probably have all the books. It is often called the gospel of grace, because that Paul hits grace. And the big distinction is that we're saved by grace, but we're also live by grace. And that was the hard thing that the Jews couldn't catch. We're saved by grace, by faith in Christ. But now we got to go back and live like the law. And they said, you're missing the point. You're saved by grace, you live by grace. And that's a hard concept to get a hold of. The book's one of the earliest. Some people think 1 Thessalonians, but Galatians, I think, kind of fits before 1 Thessalonians. And it's a clear gospel message, and Paul defends his apostleship. Now, why would Paul have to defend his apostleship? I mean, he's an apostle. Why would he have to defend the fact that he's an apostle? There were 12, right? Do you realize the apostles had picked somebody else? A guy named Matthias in Acts? And you never hear from that guy again. So we think they rushed ahead and picked somebody to take Judas' spot. That's why they needed another one, because Judas was like disqualified from the apostleship. He lost his credentials and so on. And so they had to pick somebody new, and I think without any doubt that it was Paul. Paul was the 12th apostle, not Matthias. But he had to convince people that he was really an apostle.
Also, Ron, one of the definitions of apostle was one who had seen the living Christ. Okay.
But Paul never did that, right? Paul never did that.
Except on the road to Damascus.
That's right.
But he had not seen him in the flesh prior to that.
Or was taught by him is a big part of it, yeah. Because it goes in order. If you study church history, there's the apostles, then there's the apostolic fathers. Those are people who knew the apostles. Then you have the church fathers. Those are the ones that knew the people that knew the apostles. Yeah, some people, I guess human nature, people want credentials and they want to feel like, I knew one of the apostles. Well, big deal, so what? I got the same Bible you have, so yeah, doesn't make a difference. But the emphasis on salvation by grace through faith, the Christian life is also part there, all right? And supporting the fellow Christians to engage in good works. Paul said in the end of the book, you reap what you sow. When people say, well, I can live by grace, I can live what I want. But you reap what you sow, remember that. Yeah. Don't get too uppity about that. An interesting feature of Galatians is the only one of Paul's letters that he wrote himself. He had what's known as amanuensis, which is a big word for secretary. And I wish I had some of those that did the writing for you, and you just kind of dictated. But it looks like Paul had probably bad eyesight, and it was tough to write. Because look what he said. This is a quote from Acts. Acts, that's in the end of Galatians. See what large letter have I used to write to you with my own hand. And he said that I wrote this with my own hand, and see which large letters, so he could see what he was writing. Yeah. But that's Galatians 6:22. I don't know. I guess I was spending a lot of time in Acts preparing this quote. All right, a title. Books need a title. Kind of everything needs a title. So the titles were taken from the New Testament books from the first line. That's not unusual. If you look at the Pentateuch, the Hebrew name for Pentateuch is Bereshith, which means in the beginning. The word for Exodus is names. That's the name of the book for Shemot. What it is simply these are the names of the people that went into Egypt. You know how many people went into Egypt with Abraham's family? It was 72, and they only came out 2 million. But it took 430 years to do that. Yeah. So it took 430 years to do that. Yeah. VonBehren is the name for the Greek name, the Hebrew name for Numbers. It means in the wilderness. Numbers talks about the time in the wilderness. So the name of the Hebrew book is Numbers. That's the name of the book. I always got a cute because the Septuagint are the ones that added the numbers to it, and they added Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus and Deuteronomy and the Numbers. Guess what name they used? The book in the Septuagint is Arithmoi.
That's why.
Arithmoi.
Ah.
Sounds like arithmetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, number is arithmetic. So can you imagine? That's the name of the book. All right, so Stephanus, this guy Robert Stephanus was the guy that invented the verse division. Look at the date, 1551. There were no divisions in the Bible, Old or New Testament. They had to be added by human. And so sometimes it's wise if you read a book on the Bible, especially letters, that you kind of ignore the chapters and the verses, because sometimes they were wrong. They made a bad choice when they divided it up. And sometimes you lose a thought or lose something by stopping. Oh, I'll read just one chapter a day. I just remember hearing that somewhere. Where did I hear that? One chapter a day. And you stop at the chapter when you should have probably read the next couple verses in the next chapter to complete the thought and the idea that was there. Okay, so that's the title. The title of the book is The Epistle of the Apostle Paul to the Galatians. Right? Now a little bit about the author, and I think I put too much about the author. I got carried away. I had to stop. Because this class is almost built as the life of Paul. I could turn this into the course of the life of Paul, but pretty easily. But let's just take a quick survey, because we want to get into Galatians. So this is the idea. Paul authorship is almost universally accepted. It fits so well with Acts. It sounds like him. Everybody kind of says, yeah. They dispute some other books, but Galatians is fully Paul. Okay. It is considered the foundation of all his writings. Fits with the book of Acts because he just visited Galatia. Okay. And he's attested by other places. Peter mentions Paul, letters by Paul. You realize Peter mentions Paul in his book? Yeah, which is kind of, I don't think people know that, but he does. He actually mentions that on my other friend Paul wrote some books too. So he gives attestation to that. And then these guys are church fathers. They all mention Paul. They said they're talking about it, they're writing commentaries, making comments, and they talk about the book of Galatians written by Paul. So got a lot of attestation that he wrote it. And it's in the Marcion and the Muratorian canons. These are a list of books. Early list. When you say early, look at the dates. Yeah, it's into the 2nd century. Yeah. So we don't have anything before that. We have a couple papyri, little snippets of scripture that people have found, but it's not very much. And then the earliest manuscript is Papyrus 46. I guess they got tired of names, but they did 46. And that's dated 2nd century. But we have a clear lineage of Paul. We go back and see the book of Galatians written in the 2nd century, a copy of it. Now you realize things like Homer, Iliad, and the Odyssey, we have the earliest are like 900 AD. So when people compare the Bible and manuscripts, we got Homer and Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, the oldest manuscript is 900 AD. We've got biblical things 200 AD. Yeah, so much better. Okay, Paul was a Jew, so that was born a Jew, right? And there's the verse, Romans 11:1. I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. Who else was from Benjamin that kind of relates to Saul? King Saul was Benjamin, so Apostle Paul was also Saul. So it looks like he got his name from the first king of Israel. All right, and let's see. Yeah. He was also called Paul. Now that's kind of interesting. A lot of people think that Jesus gave him the name Paul on the road to Damascus, but that's not so. Okay, that's kind of somebody said it, and everybody else repeated it. It looks like he was Saul Paul. That was kind of his name. He had both the time of birth. And when he started dealing with the Greeks, he switched from Saul to Paul. On the island of Cyprus is when he switched names. You watch the Acts, he's Saul. All of a sudden, he's Paul. So it looks like he's talking to Gentiles, and Paul fit better with Gentiles than Saul. He was a devout Pharisee, which means he was a strict adherent to the scriptures. If anyone thinks he has reason to put confidence in flesh, I more, circumcised the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law of Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for legalistic, righteous, faith fruitful, okay? At the same time, Paul's life, he studied under the teacher Gamaliel. So he mentions that I studied under this great Hebrew scholar. And so that he got the best teaching he could get in Hebrew education. Curiously, he was a Roman citizen. Paul was also a Roman citizen. It says several times in Acts. Paul said to the officers, they beat us publicly without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. When Paul was arrested in Caesarea and facing trial, he claimed the right as a Roman citizen. Okay. I appeal to Caesar, only a Roman citizen can do that. And persecutor Felix responded, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. All right. And a Roman centurion proclaimed, this man is a Roman citizen. When Paul asked to confirm his citizenship, he said, yes, I am. That's pretty good. And the commander responded, he had paid a big price for the Roman citizenship, to which Paul responded, I was born a Roman citizen. Okay. So Paul was born in Tarsus. You can see the map. Tarsus is right on the edge with that curve between Asia Minor and Palestine. You can see it there in the corner. In the province of Sicilia, which made a Roman province in 64 by Pompey, he declared it to be a Roman province. When the Romans started out, they started out in one little place in Rome, and they ended up conquering all of Italy, and then Sicily, then Spain, and they met the Punics, okay, Carthage, the Carthaginians, and defeated them. And then they started moving east, and they moved slowly, and they would conquer lands. And they would take guys that would say, hey, we love you guys, we're fine. He would make that a governor, it would be a province. Or he would be a client state, they could run themselves. As long as you're loyal to us, you can run yourself, you can be king of whatever you want to be king of. But when they revolted, then Rome slowly tightened the grip, and turned these things into provinces, and then they became counties of Rome. And so that's what happened, okay? And let's see, where we're at that. All right, now listen, this next paragraph is kind of interesting. Even though Paul's life coincided with the life of Jesus, okay, they were about 10 years apart. So when Paul was born, Jesus was about 10 years old. So that kind of connects the two people, all right? There was little doubt, however, that Paul had heard about Jesus. I mean, I can't imagine being a Pharisee and all the things that Jesus did that he hadn't heard about him. And the claim of his resurrection, all right? Jesus would have been about 10. Paul would have been about 25 at the time of the crucifixion. Paul is the first mentioned in the book of Acts after the crucifixion of the stoning of Stephen. So he was at the stoning, the first martyr, Christian martyr was Stephen. And Paul was there to hold the cloaks of the people that stoned him. And meanwhile, witnesses laid their clothes at the feet of Saul. That's from Acts 7. The writer of Acts in the next verse says, Paul was there giving his approval to Stephen's stoning. Christians were scattered due to this intense persecution. So right off the bat, Jesus claimed the apostles had preached resurrection. A lot of Jews got upset, and he bestowed and stoned people who had any kind of an idea that I support the risen Christ. And that's when Paul began his persecution. He somehow at that point got real excited about it and says, I'm going to go after these Christians and stomp this thing out. We're going to end Christianity right here. And that was kind of his goal. And it says from Acts that he made murderous threats about the Christians. So Paul was that way. But his life did change, and abruptly. I don't know how you became a Christian, but was it sudden, or can you point to it? Some people can point to exactly the hour, the date, where they were. Some says, I know I trusted Christ somewhere in here somewhere. Anybody want to share when you can exact point that you remember trusting Christ as your Savior? Can you remember the day, the hour? You can?
I can't remember the day and the hour, but we had a very strong Christian in our church, and we were at summer camp, and he, down on your knees and pray, and and I accepted it there, and then we went back to church, but the one thing I remember was the guy was a smoker, and he had such strong smell of smoke.
He wanted you to think about hell for a while. That was his method of evangelism.
But he was also, he was a farmer, and if he killed a pig, 10% of that pig went to the church.
How do you figure that out?
Wow.
I mean,
What's 10% of a pig?
he contradicted himself. 10% of the meat went to the church.
Yeah, go ahead.
I had a very similar to what Paul had. I was getting ready to go to Vietnam. I've shared this before. I was getting ready to go to Vietnam. I went to a Bible camp, had no concept of Christianity, and the pastor was up there speaking, and he said, someone here tonight is going to accept the Lord. And with every head bowed and every eye closed, and I was looking around because I was so fascinated by this, that someone would accept. I had no idea what they were even talking about. And all of a sudden the room went bright white, just as bright as it could possibly go. I knew nothing about Paul's conversion experience, nothing. The room went bright white, and a voice literally inside my brain said, he's waiting for you, because he was asking for someone to come forward. And I was the only person that went forward out of about 200 people. And I accepted the Lord with no concept what I was doing. But it changed my life forever. You know?
You weren't on a horse or anything like that.
Yeah. You know, where Paul seems to have all this knowledge, you know, but for
Well,
me,
to
it
switch
was,
the knowledge from debating that Jesus was the Messiah to proving he was the Messiah. That's a
Yeah.
big switch.
Awesome.
Anybody else want to share quickly? Maybe one more that would like to say where you suddenly trusted Christ? It was a moment in time that you can really nail. Because I grew up in a church. Okay, man.
Okay. Massapequa in New Jersey had a church that my parents didn't agree with. Yes, you know, one was Dutch Reformed, and they were more Pentecostal. And regardless of what kind of church it was, the drawing that I had to that church is what I felt when you both felt that, because Christ came. I accepted the calling. Christ came right into me. I know he did. I could feel. You can't explain it. Everybody who's a Christian here knows that feeling that you have. And when I came home from the Pentecostal church to my home, nobody believed that it happened, but it wasn't the way they taught. It was Christ who came in me and showed me his realism. Yeah.
So let's take a look at Paul's conversion here. What happened? Paul's life changed forever on a trip to Damascus, in which he was seeking to arrest Christians. But look at this, is kind of interesting. These that belong to the way. That's right from Scripture. That's what early Christians were called. They're people of the way. It wasn't until later in Acts that Christians were then called Christians at Antioch. There was a big, heavy church in Antioch, and the first time people said, "Oh, you must be the Christians, Christ-like people." And so it changed. And I think there was a movement here around somewhere where they called themselves the Way, and I think I've seen Bibles called the Way. So they're going back to the very roots of Christianity. Okay, on his way to Damascus, and Paul was struck blind with a bright light. The risen Jesus identified himself to Paul as the one he was persecuting. Now that's got to be incredible surprise. So, bright light, all of a sudden the guy said, "You know the guy you've been persecuting? It's me. I'm the one you've been persecuting." And see the charge and change when you were persecuting somebody, all of a sudden they're the ones that show up. So you're the one, everybody kind of that way, you're the one saying bad things about me. Like I said about Darius last week. All right. And did Paul believe? All right. So the question is, did he believe then or 3 days later? We don't know. Okay. But at some point, was it sudden? Yeah, immediately, or did he say, "I need a minute to think about it"? But he didn't believe, and I put it in parentheses because it doesn't really say it. He believed there. Okay. Later he did. Okay. As soon as his sight was restored, he was baptized. Almost immediately, he was baptized almost immediately. That's like what today, I was impressed with the pastor said. The kid that received Christ at camp, going to be baptized within a week. And normally you trust Christ and weeks later, days later or something, that you get baptized. But it's kind of interesting to get baptized almost as soon as you believe that you're baptized. And we could get into baptism sometime, but no. He immediately began to preach. I mean, I guess he knew what he was talking about, because he had been well trained, right? In the Hebrew scriptures. And proving that Jesus is the Christ. So right away, he had the Old Testament. He goes, hey, look at all these passages that now make sense to me. And you can imagine how the Old Testament opened up. Because a lot of times we read it, and then later on, like, oh, that's talking about Jesus. Oh, I see that now. Or Jesus quoted that scripture about himself from the Old Testament. Now Paul could see all those verses and say, man, what a change immediately to reinterpret the Old Testament and seeing Christ there. All right. So the Jews got so upset and then preaching that in Damascus. Here's the guy on false pretenses. Now he's preaching Christ, that they wanted to kill him. And so this is a famous story I learned in flannel graph in Sunday school, where they lowered Paul over the walls in a basket. And that's how he got away. So he ran to Jerusalem, and Barnabas introduced Paul to Christians to the city of Jerusalem. So when Paul got there, can you imagine seeing this guy that was mercifully killing Christians? All of a sudden he shows up and says, I'm a Christian. Tough to believe. So we give a lot of credit to Barnabas. I think his name means consolation. He was the one that I know it, I've seen it, I witnessed it. He really is a changed man. He really did believe. And you can see the power of somebody who was so negative become so positive in such a short amount of time. Yeah. Nancy and I, a couple weeks ago, we saw the movie on C.S. Lewis, where he was the reluctant convert. Yeah. That he fought it and fought it and fought it and fought it and fought it, and finally he became a Christian. All right. All right. And so he was, again, when Paul went there and went about the city preaching, he didn't stop. Went to Jerusalem, started preaching. So the Grecian Christians, those were Hellenistic Jews, people that accepted the Hellenistic culture that was founded by which guy? Who founded Hellenism in Israel and Palestine? It's been a while. Alexander the Great, yeah. And he's the one that was not Greek, he was Macedonian, but he accepted. Guess who his tutor was? Guess what this makes me so jealous when I read about Alexander the Great's tutor was? Aristotle. His father was Philip II. Can you imagine? Here's your tutor. This guy's name's Aristotle. He's my tutor, my personal tutor. So he adopted the Greek culture and spread it everywhere he went, and spread it all through that. And Hellenistic means Greek-like, so it became a Greek-like culture. It wasn't really Greek, but it was a lot of the Greek principles that were spread by Alexander the Great. All right, so his success caused the Grecian Jews to try to kill him. So they quickly shuffled him all back to Tarsus. They put him on a ship, sent him back to his home, get him out of here before something happens. Get him on more friendly territory. Went back to Tarsus. Now this one is interesting. The next little paragraph, what happened next? A while later, Barnabas came to Tarsus. He was looking for Paul. Okay, he knew this guy Paul, and Paul was there ministering in Tarsus. And Barnabas says, hey, wait a second, I remember this guy Paul. That's the kind of guy I want to hang out with and be a companion with. I had that experience too when I first tried to witness when I was newly saved. I hung out with this guy named Hank Lindstrom. He had a candy red convertible, and he would go to the beach, and people would gather around the car. It was such a beautiful car, and then he would pass out tracts. And so I went with him because I got to ride in the car. And then I would get out there, and I just couldn't believe it. This guy's out preaching, witnessing, and passing out tracts, and people are responsive. And then it got serious when he said, here, talk to this guy, Ron. And I go, whoa. So here I am learning about this stuff in Bible college, and then all of a sudden I'm trying to do it. And it's just like, So if you have trouble and you're timid, get around somebody who does it right and make them a companion. Yes?
Yesterday, I had someone come through my line over at Universal Studios, and they were giving out the tracts. from the people that were coming to Universal Studios. And one of the guys that were taking the surveys next to me handed me one of the tracts and said, you know, he's making fun, and he said, some guy just gave this to me, and I said, well, do you know what he looked like? Because I was going to introduce myself to him. And he said, well, I know he had a, you know, he gave a description of Moses, and I said, well, at least you know it wasn't Harry Potter.
Yeah,
The track thing, that's a really good way to do it, because, you know.
Well, I was so reluctant and shy when I was growing up. I had a job at Publix, and I was a bag boy, and I had a pocket full of tracts. I put one in every bag that I packed. I thought I was doing my duty for Christ. I was a coward. So I had to force myself to be around somebody who was an aggressive Christian. Yeah.
Just don't leave a tract as a tip for the waitress. She doesn't appreciate it.
Oh, if you leave a $20 bill.
Yeah.
The tip plus a track, but some people think, well, I'll just give a track, and that's not.
Yeah, if you don't leave a big tip, don't leave a tract. I actually learned that in Bible conference. We're told in class, if you leave a tip, a tract, leave a big tip. Yeah, so do that, okay. So Barnabas goes and he found him in Antioch, so he had to find Paul. And he invited him to come to Antioch from Tarsus. So Antioch becomes Paul's home church. That's his place of, where his home church is, his church family. So he moved from Tarsus to Antioch, which is not a far distance. Okay. Antioch, there it is, says Paul became his home church. During the time that the elders of the church in Antioch sent relief to Jerusalem, and so it was a famine during the time of Claudius, and the church at Antioch was a little bit better off, and the Jews were suffering in Jerusalem, so they sent Paul and Barnabas with some money to get some food and help feed the people there. All right?
Ron,
Yeah.
do you have any theories on Paul's silent years, the wilderness years, the desert years?
No, I wish I did. Was he in school? He was there 3 years in the desert. Yeah, because did I skip over that part? Because I thought I put it in here.
I didn't see it. I'm just curious.
See if I did.
What was that?
I'm trying to go
He had
fast.
that vision or something about being in heaven or something?
No, that's in the second Corinthians 12,
That would be
where Paul
interesting.
talks about it in Corinthians, that he was. And I'm going to mention it later when he gets to the Listerines. Lystra, what are they called? The Listerines? People. Lystra. And so after what they do though is look at some at the bottom line. There's some interesting development. After completing the mission, they return, taking John, who's also named Mark. So John Mark shows up in the picture, who was a cousin of Barnabas. Okay, so he comes back. They bring him back with them. Says, "Come on, go back to our church." So you can see the church is growing and developing, and then moving from that very thing that Christ had started in Jerusalem, then Judea, and the other parts of the world. And you're going to see that happen in Paul's life.
And that John Mark is the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, because he wasn't a companion of Paul. Yeah, Paul didn't get along. So Barnabas and Paul continued to minister in Antioch until the Spirit said, "We want you to go out as missionaries." So they were there ministering, teaching. The church at Antioch was very strong. It was one of the 5 pillars, because Christianity had like Jerusalem and Alexandria, Ephesus, all right, and the 5th one was Rome. And what happens is the Eastern churches all fall under Muslims. Rome is the only one that's still free, and so we end up with Pope being the Bishop of Rome. That's how that got started. Yeah, because that was the only one that was big, but it wasn't taken over by others. Okay. All right, and so this begins Paul's first missionary trip to the region of Galatia. That's where we're headed for with the book of Galatia. That's the area he does it. And I first ran into Galatia, I thought it was a city. It's not a city, it's a province. There are cities within the province of Galatia. Okay. All right, the 2 missionaries, along with John Mark, left Antioch in AD 47 about. I tried to put together a chronology for you, but there's so many variants, there's so many Bible teachers that are off. That's the bad news, they're all a little bit different. The good news is they're all within a couple of years of each other. So we're pretty clear. Paul, born in about 5, died about 67, And in that 62 years, he did all that ministry. So we have a good feel for where he was. He took 3 missionary journeys. He went to Rome, and then we think there's maybe a 4th missionary journey we'll talk about shortly. All right, so let's see what happens. Okay, they first traveled to the island of Cyprus. You can see that in the map. It's very small. There's a bigger one on page. I had some space, I noticed, so I put some stuff in there. You don't let space go to waste, right? And it's just, I think it's on page.
94?
Yeah, page 18. You can see it a lot better. That was a small one. This is a big one. Yeah, you can see where he is. You see where Tarshish is? All right, so that's where Paul's born. And then he moved to Antioch as his church. He went to Seleucia, then across to Salamis, and then Cyprus. All right, and then he headed up to Galatia. So you can see where he went. All right, the first traveled to the island of Cyprus, in which they traveled across, preaching the gospel. I remember, and I tried that a little bit. I gave it up in Bible college. My sophomore year. I started taking mission trips with a couple of my friends. We get in a car and just say, we're going to just drive. And every time we see people, we'll stop and talk to them. Yeah, I thought that was a great idea. I was on my first missionary journey, second missionary journey. I don't know why I eventually stopped doing them because it got expensive. But just to try what that was like, and that's really a cool thing. And just to get in the car one day and just go and you see a group of people, stop, pull off the road, got out track, stop. Yeah. So to kind of get a feel for what a missionary journey might be, but that's what they did. Anybody they encountered, they talked to. And they went all the way across the island of Cyprus and they came to this guy in this island of Paphos. His name was Sergio Paulus. And they witnessed to this guy and he was listening and he called them in over and says, he's the proconsul representing Rome. And he calls over Paul and Barnabas and says, what are you guys teaching here? What are you talking about? I'm interested. And he was listening and all of a sudden this guy comes, a guy named Elymas, comes out. He's a sorcerer and he starts trying to stop it because he's representing the devil. He's trying to stop them from converting this guy, his meal ticket to Christ. And so Paul strikes him blind right in front of him, right in front of this guy, Paulus, and I believe. So he led the Roman proconsul to the Lord right there in the island before they head up to Galatia. All right, so Paul they leave Cyprus, sailing to Perga on the coast, which is the coast of Asia Minor. And John Mark left to return to Jerusalem. He left. He was afraid. Maybe Larry has a theory on that one, right? Why did John depart? But later on, when Paul goes on the second journey, Barnabas said, let's go, let's take John Mark with us. And Paul says, no, I don't trust the guy. He backed down, he did something, he left us, he abandoned us when we were on our journey. We don't want to take him again. So what did that do? A bad thing turned into a good thing because Paul took Silas and Barnabas took Mark, and we had 2 teams rather than 1. So that kind of tells me, do we have arguments within church, ministry arguments, who's in charge of this, who's in charge of that? Well, it's nice to know they did too, these great people. Yeah, here's Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Mark. 4 of them couldn't get along, so they split up into 2 groups. So it turned out to be good that happened. All right, and so they first preached about their history, all right? It's amazing when you read the book of Acts. Paul, when he's speaking, says, remember way back in Abraham, and he did this, and then we had the judges, and we had this, and we had David, and now we have the Messiah. And so he gave the history of the Jew because he was well versed in the Old Testament, okay? And so he'd go to the synagogue and do that, and then come up, and at the end he'd say they'd be listening to their history, and all of a sudden, bam, Jesus is the Messiah. He's the one you were waiting for. He's the one the Old Testament talked about. So that was great to go to those and do it. But he also hit the Gentiles too. And so eventually Paul's ministry is going to concentrate on Gentiles rather than Jews. And Peter is going to be the one that's going to be the apostle of the Jews. Okay. And again, the Jewish leaders grew jealous. So everywhere they went, they were upset with the crowds and the converts. They were making converts and leading Jews to the Lord. And so they stirred up the leaders at the town, expelled them, so they kicked them out. So get out of here, we don't want you here. So they go to the next city. Undaunted, they go to the next city. which is a place called Iconium, where they first went, I guess I should say went, to Jewish synagogues. Great number of Jews and Gentiles believed. Other Jews and Gentiles rejected the gospel message, so there was always opposition. Some received, some don't. Some see it, some don't. It's got to be a sad thing when people reject. So what do you do when that happens? I guess you pray to the Lord that maybe someday down the road, the seed has been planted. And I know stories about people who have heard the message and years later will respond. So you never know. Okay? So you keep up the look, okay, and move on. All right, and then the city was divided between the believers and the non-believers. And the enemies of the disciples plotted to stone them. So that got pretty serious. They're going to be stoned. On my little mini missionary trips, nobody ever threatened to stone me or anything. And, you feel like, where's the persecution? I should have some. But I can't imagine living under that kind of persecution when somebody's going to throw rocks on your head because you're preaching the gospel. Yeah, all right. And when they heard the plot, Paul and Barnabas fled. They got out of there. So they ran because of that. But they just went to the next city. There's plenty of cities to go to, so they went to the next one. And that was Lystra. And I think that's why they were called the Lystraeans. All right, so when Paul got to Lystra, he performed a miracle of healing. All right, some lame man had been lame since birth. Paul healed him, and it gave him right away favorable attention. And that's a great lesson. I guess I taught that when we did the class on personal evangelism. The key to doing anything is gaining favorable attention. Helping somebody with a luggage or a bag, or saying something nice, or going in and talking to them, then move into the gospel. Get that favorable attention first. Okay, and that's the very important concept in witnessing is somehow look for some way to gain some kind of favorable attention. And then people are much, much more likely to listen to you. So Paul did a healing. He learned that's the way to get attention. Okay, and so the people saw the miracle and thought Paul and Barnabas were gods. That was a problem. They thought that Paul was Hermes. And then we know who Hermes is in the Roman pantheon. Hermes was Greek. You get the word hermeneutics, which is the Bible interpretation. But Hermes was known as, think FTD.
Delivery.
Mercury. Why was Mercury, huh? Hermes.
Hermes or
H-E-R-M-E-S.
Yeah, Hermes or Mercury, the messenger.
Yeah.
One
That's
degree.
why the planet Mercury is called Mercury, because it was the fastest planet.
Right.
Yeah. Their day is longer than their year on Mercury. All right. If you study astronomy at all. But he's the one that delivered the flower. FTD took the winged guy was
Winged feet.
Yeah, winged feet. All right, so and then they thought that Barnabas was Zeus. I guess Paul talked a lot. See, that's kind of the indication in Acts that Paul was the spokesman. He did the speaking. Barnabas was there for comfort, consolation. Right? But Paul was the big mouth, right? And that's why he was called Mercury, the messenger god. All right. And some Jews came to Lystra to Jewish supporters. So the other cities, people followed him from the other cities where he had been there preaching. To Lystra, to give him some pastors. And some Jews came there and supporters stoned Paul. Now he actually gets stoned. I don't mean that in the contemporary form. It's the ancient form. All right, and dragged him outside the city and left him for dead. He was there for a few days and then got up and walked and went back into the city. Now my theory is what Jewel was mentioning was that Paul actually died, because in the book of 2 Corinthians he says, "I was caught up into the third heaven." Whether I was in the body or not, I don't know. So I think Paul was actually dead, and he went to heaven and God resurrected him. That's the theory among different Bible teachers. Any of you Bible teachers have a theory on that? Whether Paul was really dead or not? You've never encountered that later? Okay, that idea. But I think, as I look at the scriptures, because you're stoned, hit with rocks, you don't get up in a couple of days and go back in. I think he was resurrected.
So why do you say it was a couple of days that he got up?
Because it says for a little while. He was there for a little while, and then he got up and went back into the city. Yeah. So he went back in after he'd been stoned. Okay. And Paul actually died from the stoning, and there's where 2 Corinthians talks about him caught in the third heavens. And he says, I don't know if I was in my body or I was in my spirit, I went to heaven. And so Paul does say that we actually went to heaven, and I've seen it. Doesn't he say later on that like eyes not seen, ears not heard, the wonders that God has prepared for you? Because he actually saw them. He had a glimpse of heaven, just like we have a glimpse of Galatians. Right? All right, the next day they left for the next city, Derbe. And they preached the gospel in Derbe and won many converts. The book of Acts doesn't give any details. So when you think of all the things that are there that happen that we get the book of Acts, it could be a huge, several volumes of books of all the adventures of Paul, but we get little bits of it. And Derbe didn't mention very much. But he traveled back, so after they got to Derbe, they went back the same route, went back to Iconium and Lystra and Antioch, strengthened the churches, encouraged them, they appointed leaders of the church. Yeah. All right, so you can see the real growth of church planting, what they did. They went back and visited these churches, and they were welcomed back. And from what people guess, it was about a year and a half, the entire journey, from beginning to end was about a year and a half. All right? And they preached in Derbe, and then they strengthened the churches and managed them. They appointed elders in the churches and committed them to the Lord. Then they traveled to Perga, which is on the coast, and out of the city, Attilia is on the coast. Preached the gospel in those cities. So took every opportunity they had. From Attila, they sailed back to Antioch, and that's when Paul wrote Galatians. That's where he finally hit, where the book of Galatians was written. Paul writes it to these churches that he just been to. He gets back to Antioch. Some think that he probably wrote it earlier because of the expediency of the book, that he's really on fire when he writes that book. Yeah, but he might have done it sooner. They're welcome back to their hometown. They share all the things that happened on that journey, and they glorify the Lord for that. After a time in Antioch, I'll just do this quickly here. A time in Antioch, traveled up to Jerusalem, attended the Council of Jerusalem. This was the first church council. So Paul and Barnabas and a few others were the representatives. The first time, because they were having issues, the leader of the church in Jerusalem was James. Peter was there, and they called a meeting of all of the Christian leaders to come to Jerusalem for a council. And that was the first. I actually have it in the notebook, and if you go back to the end, it's there. I don't know we'll have time to look at it closely, but you should read it. It happens right there. I didn't have time to stick it in there, but on page 27, there's the passage in Acts that covers that council. That Peter spoke and says, we don't expect the Gentiles to be like Jews. Paul and Barnabas spoke at that council, and they said, we can give you witness that many Gentiles trusted Christ. Peter said, I talked to Gentiles, and they got the Holy Spirit just like we did, without having to go to the law. So they gave a lot of testimony. James finally gets up. If you look what James said, where's the council? All right, second, split up. All right. Okay, there's the beginning of the split. And the second paragraph on page 8 is the split. All right, you can see where that happened. I wanted to read the statement of James. There it is on page 7. It's the last paragraph there, the Council of Jerusalem. James was the leader of the church, and then spoke. He quoted from the book of Amos that said, God says Gentiles will be part of my people. So now they're settling the issue. Do Gentiles have to become Jews to become Christians? No. They could come right to Christ, not have to go through Judaism. They could go right to Christ. And he talks about that. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for Gentiles who are trusting in God. Then he called for a letter to be sent, and he sent the letter back with 2 guys, Judas, not that Judas, and Silas. So Silas ends up back in Antioch, which he's going to leave with Barnabas. Christians in Antioch read the letter, were glad for the encouraging message. Judas and Silas returned to Jerusalem, while Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, where they and many others taught and preached the word of the Lord. So that had been a very, very happening church. Maybe the first mega church was in Antioch. After some time passed, and there's the problem with chronology. That says that more than once. After some time passed, Paul was there for a while. It didn't give dates, so it's hard to pin it down. But you can within a couple years, so that's the problem. But look at the split. Let's see. They visit their converts. They want to go back and visit their converts. And since they first visit, this this occasioned Paul for a second missionary journey. Let's go back. We want to go second. And then they're going to go beyond that. They're going to go back there and keep going. All right, so Paul and Barnabas split over the inclusion of John Mark. Paul did not want to take him on his journey because he had abandoned them in their journey, the first journey. So Paul took Silas, Barnabas chose to take John Mark with him, and they set off. And there's the secondary journey. We don't get any information on Barnabas and John Mark, where they went, what they did. Again, you wish you had that, because that's the attitude of a teacher. Well, I want more. Give me more. Let me find another source. Let's find more. It's not enough to get this. All right, so they go on the third messenger journey. That's where I kind of cut things off. I said, this is getting way too long for a 3-hour class. So I said, here's second journey, here's third journey. And it had nothing to do with Galatians, so I let it go. So Paul Missy was arrested, where he was eventually martyred, okay? The last recorded events in Paul's is him being in a house in Rome, and people come to visit him. And it says that Paul spoke boldly, without hindrance. He preached the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the last verse in Acts. We lose it there. But many scholars and people outside the Bible said Paul went further. He got released and was arrested again later. So Paul was released from jail and he went to Spain. That's kind of the idea that Paul went to Spain. We only have the information from Titus and 2 Timothy about him going places, visiting places. And so this is where the book of Acts ends. All right, things took place. We think he went to Nero because he said God told him, you're going to go before Nero and you're going to give a testimony to the Roman emperor. Now, what a great thing is that? Paul had to be arrested in order to speak to the Emperor Nero. So God put him, and there's a little picture of that. Right? Here appears that Paul was released from prison. Okay. I kind of want to finish this section. Clear indication that Paul was set free to continue his ministry, expecting to stay with Philemon, but instead went to Spain. Now look here's a little bit of testimony outside the Bible. Okay. Let's go to Spain to visit. Let's see where it is. Yeah, next paragraph. St. Paul probably went to Spain. Church Father Clement, writing in Rome about 95 AD, tells us that Paul had preached in the East. Now, he's got the stories coming down the line. These people are telling him as a kid the stories of Paul. Remember when Paul was here, he did this and this. And then he writes a very important little passage here. Let's see, where is it? Yeah. He had preached in the East and the West. He won the genuine glory of his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world and having reached the farthest limits of the West. Now, where would be the farthest limits of the West? If you're in Italy, Greece, Rome, what would be the farthest to the West?
Spain.
Spain and England.
And England.
Yeah. So that's the ocean comes next, right? Yeah. So to them that was the end of the world. When you reach Spain, you're at the end of the world. It took a while for people to get the courage to leave Spain and venture out from there. So that's good old Clement. All right. Then Paul returned from Spain, continued his fourth missionary journey, in parentheses. It's believed he reached the islands of Crete, Ephesus, Miletus, Troas, and the cities of Macedonia, Corinth, and probably Nicopolis. Those are from Timothy. We get little glimpses in the book of 2 Timothy that he went to those places. Now here's the closing thing. I guess I wanted to get a little farther than this, but he was arrested after his journey was coming to a close, possibly in western Greece, taken to Rome and in prison. This happened during the Nero's severe wave of persecution. In 65, there was a fire in Rome. Nero blamed the Christians for it, and he really persecuted them. You read in Suetonius that he would use Christians on a pole, set them on fire, and use them for lighting his parties. That's how bad it was. Right? So Paul probably got caught up in that. Okay. And his condition being harsher than the first time in prison, Paul mostly tried and likely beheaded. In 67 or 68, he wrote that many Christians deserted him, but the Lord strengthened him. And Paul died as bravely as he lived. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. That's the last verse of Timothy. But Paul was expecting to die. And you can see that there's the trip to Rome.